Does God have favourites? And really, we're asking two questions. Does God have favourite things? Does God have favourite people? We all have favourite things, don't we? I wonder what's on your list. So if I said to you, what's your favourite place? Immediately, if you were asking me, Durham Cathedral. Favourite smell? Brown bread, fresh out of the oven, because it reminds me of my grandma's. Favourite thing to taste? Well, I've got a terrible diet. I love 3 foods. They all begin with C: chips, cheese and chocolate. I know it's bad, but I'm an easy person to have round for you for a tea. Chips, cheese and chocolate. Things that are your favourite. Things that you like to listen to. Things that you watch. And of course, everybody has favourite things. But when we look at this passage in James, it's not about things, is it? It's not about favourite things. It's about, do we favour particular people? And as our friend kindly read to us, he read the title of this chapter, Favouritism is Forbidden. Whew! Crikey, friends, we need to get ready this morning. I often think we should come to church with a hard hat on, like a crash helmet. Because actually, if we really opened ourselves up to God, we'd be like, oh my goodness me, what's going on here? Because God interrupts and disrupts us. When I ask the question, who is on this church's list of favourite people? Who is included and who's excluded? I think it should stir in us one of those ouch moments. Because we tend to have friends who are like us, share our principles and share our prejudices. We tend to be surrounded with people who are like us. That's understandable. But here's the ouch moment, friends. It's not the gospel. Jesus didn't do that, and the Bible suggests otherwise. So, verse 1 of James chapter 1. My brothers and sisters, do you, with your acts of favouritism, really believe in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ? Oh, so here's the ouch moment. Do you, with your acts of favouritism? So, friends, we often talk about what we believe, don't we? This morning we've already sang our beliefs. The songbook is called Singing the Faith. We sing what we believe. And then there's how we act. Sometimes what we think, what we say, and how we act, they're very different. And sometimes how we act believes what we really think about God, about faith. They reveal something. Our actions reveal something. And in this text, James is critiquing the people and saying, you with your acts of favouritism, I'm not sure you really believe the whole gospel. Why do we show favouritism? It's nothing new, is it? We show favouritism because we're human and we're flawed and we get things wrong. And actually, we've been getting things wrong for 2,000 years. We're often prejudiced on the basis of gender, sexuality, ethnicity, class, and people who are wealthy and people who are experiencing poverty. Every day, God invites us to something more, friends. Every day, we are invited to open up our hearts to God to live differently. In the story of The Sound of Music, Captain Von Trapp, he loved his children, didn't he? Do you remember the story? He's a captain who hires young Maria. Well, Maria is sent by the convent because she's misbehaving. So the convent send her to Captain Von Trapp to act as a governess to his 7 children. But his wife has died. So in the film, we meet a man who is grieving and who has become a strict disciplinarian. He absolutely loves his children, but he doesn't communicate that, does he? So what he says and how he acts, there's a mismatch. And this text in James is saying, do we do that? What do we reveal by our actions? I think it's interesting that James uses the phrase, our glorious Lord. What do we really believe about our glorious Lord? As we come to share the Lord's Prayer in a few moments, you notice that it's our Father who art in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. It's not my Father and it's not my daily bread. That invitation to our suggests that actually until everyone is fed, that we're still going to need to pray that. Our daily bread. James goes on in verses 2 to 5 to offer an example. For if a person with gold rings and fine clothes comes into your assembly, and if a poor person comes in, you say to one, sit here, and you say to the other, stand there, you've made distinctions among yourselves and have become, this is harsh, these words are harsh, friends, judges with evil thoughts. I was 8 years old in primary school when I realised that I and my family were regarded as poor. I didn't know that until a teacher pointed to a line of us who were queuing up to get our free school meal tickets, and the teacher said, oh, that's the poor kids. Those are the poor kids. We were all given a pink ticket, friends, as opposed to all the children who paid, who had a different system and got a different coloured ticket. Everyone in the school knew we were the poor kids. And I realised that actually that was something, I was different, and it was something that was deeply shaming. I remember a teacher, this wouldn't happen now, please, queue of teachers after the service telling me it's not like this now. I know that, so thank God it isn't. I remember a teacher giving me a letter for a trip. Basically, in our house, if it cost more than 50 pence, I couldn't go. And I said to the teacher, oh, thank you, there's no point me having that letter because my family haven't got enough money for me to go. And she said, oh, it's good for you to know what your friends can do. I thought, oh, thank you very much. That's made me feel better, hasn't it? I learned something about the shame of poverty. Friends, everywhere there is poverty, there is shame, which means that there could be somebody in this church, in our community now, who is in poverty, who isn't telling anyone because they feel such a sense of shame. Anthony Reddy has this phrase that really gets me. He says that God obviously has a preferential option to the poor, but when you look at the church, sometimes maybe it looks like God has a preferential option to the middle class. The reality, friends, is there will be people in your community, in this area, in the surrounding area, who are currently experiencing poverty. That's a reality, just as it was in the time of James, that's a reality now. Because there are 13.6 million people in the UK out of a population of 67 million experiencing poverty. That includes 3.9 million children. That includes 2.4 million who are living in destitution. That title of this chapter about favouritism being forbidden. There is an invitation here, friends, of what are we going to do as God's people. Listen to what James says in verse 5. Listen, my beloved brothers and sisters, has not God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom that he has promised? In the leaflet that I've given you about Church at the Margins, you will see there some of the theological foundations, some of the core values. God did not create people to live in poverty. God created everyone with intrinsic worth, dignity, and value. And the Bible reveals what God favours. So the question, does God have favourite things? No. Does God have favourite people? No, because God isn't biased. But does God favour some things? Absolutely. And the Bible said God favours justice, God favours love, and God absolutely favours people in poverty. This is good news, friends. It's good news to the wealthy, it's good news to people experiencing poverty. Because good news and justice are absolutely gospel partners. Evangelism and justice are not two separate things. I was brought up in the Pentecostal church, and my church was all about saving souls, and we were all about tracts. I remember as a little girl giving tracts out. We used to slip them through the open windows of pubs. I don't think it was received as a blessing, to be honest with you, by the reaction of people. We used to throw them into the pub liberally, little tiny tracts with the King James Bible on them. And the Pentecostal church was known for being passionate about giving out tracts, saving souls. The Methodist church in the town was known for making casseroles. Now, in reality, you see, we need both. We need this idea of saving souls, of good news, and good news being about people being fed. They're not separate. And whenever we separate them, we do an injustice to the Bible. Martin Luther King said, "The moral arc of the universe is long, and it bends towards justice." We need to add, but someone has to do the bending. And in the Bible, that's you and I. All disciples of Christ are called to respond to people experiencing poverty. It's not an optional extra on a list of things you might do during the week. John Wesley, we're not proof texting Mr. Wesley, but he did have some good sermons, didn't he? Here's one of his line from one of his sermons. He said this, and remember this was in his day. "One great reason why the rich in general have so little sympathy for the poor is because they so seldom visit them. Hence it is that one part of the world does not know what the other suffers. Many of them do not know because they do not care to know. They keep out of the way of knowing it, and then plead their voluntary ignorance as an excuse for their hardness of heart. Keeping out of the way of knowing, avoiding people. This is the opposite of what James is trying to get at. So James in verse 6 to 8 talks about, isn't it the rich who oppress you, drag you into court? The sin of the wealthy is not to be wealthy. The sin of the wealthy is to oppress people in poverty. Jesus didn't say everyone had to give up their wealth. He didn't say that at all. Jesus said the wealthy must not oppress people, and the wealth must not be built on people getting poorer and poorer and poorer. Exploitation. And people who have been blessed with wealth need to ask, what is it that God is inviting me to do? Because poverty, economic poverty, throughout the Bible, contradicts the will of God. So this phrase that James comes up with is echoing the great commandment. You shall love your neighbour as yourself. That's love your neighbour, not hide from your neighbour. The text in Deuteronomy reinforced this, didn't it? You must not distort justice. You must not show partiality. There's an interesting text in the Bible, and somebody quoted it to me after this morning's service, so I'll remind you all of it. One of the most miserable verses in the Bible is, the poor will always be with you. It's miserable, isn't it? Because it suggests that no matter how much we hear of God, we're not going to sort that out. The poor will always be with you. But that text is a since and therefore text, and it echoes back to the book of Deuteronomy. And the quote that everybody would know who heard Jesus say, the poor will always be with you, ends like this. It says, since there will never cease to be some in need on the earth, I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and needy neighbour in your land. Oh, there's an ouch moment, friends. There's another ouch moment. I command you. This isn't an optional extra. Open your hand. And I don't think opening my hand is me giving the lovely choir here a handout. I think if someone in the choir was experiencing poverty, it wouldn't be here's a handout. It would be let me take your hand. It's the hand of friendship. It's the hand of relationship. It's to be in relationship. That's when the choir become my neighbours, when they become my friends. There's a lovely bit at the end of The Sound of Music where Captain Von Trapp is given orders and decides he must flee the Nazis. He has no intention of obeying the orders. So he's going to flee and go to another country. So the mother abbess hides him in the convent. Do you remember in the film? It's a great scene. But the best bit isn't the mother abbess hiding them. The best bit is when the two sisters, the family escape in the caretaker's car, and then the German officers go to get in their car, and it won't start because two of the nuns have pinched bits of the car engine. And I think it's a great moment. And Sister Margaretta goes to Reverend Mother and says, I have sinned. And Sister Bertha says, Reverend Mother, I have sinned too. The Mother Abbess says, what is this sin, my children? The nuns look at each other, then reveal from under their robes the engine parts. Had they sinned? Yeah. Probably. They'd stolen. What would have been the greatest sin? Not allowing the family to escape. Let's not pretend that justice isn't complicated. It is. But James clarifies that faith and works must go together. What we say and how we act, they must go together. James doesn't mention favourite things being raindrops on roses or whiskers on kittens or bright copper kettles or warm woolen mittens. But James does say that the favourite things of God are when God's people resist favouritism, because God is for all, not for some. That God's favourite things are seeing faith in Christ along with actions for Christ, and that to be open to God is to be open to people experiencing poverty. These are a few of God's favourite things. The invitation this morning is, how can we, as God's people, make God's favourite things our favourite things? Amen.